Let me quickly introduce Dr. Breslin to you. She is with us, and she will give a live talk. So Dr. Sarah Breslin is the Executive Director of the Center for Modern Languages of the Council of Europe in Graz, Austria. She has worked in the field of language education as a language teacher, in qualification development, and in supporting language teachers' professional development in several countries. So she's quite internationally oriented. A passion of hers is linking policy and practice in language and general education. She earned her PhD in the field of the professional growth of language teacher educators. In her plenary, Dr. Breslin will discuss the topic Learning Beyond Boundaries, the European Centre for Modern Languages as a transnational mediator. Please do start. We are very happy to have you here.
Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I'm from Graz in Austria. And as you've already introduced me, I'm the Executive Director of the European Centre for Modern Languages of the Council of Europe. Well, you can see from the title that what I'd like to do here is suggest that having a structure like the ECML helps us to mediate across languages, across countries, across sectors, and that this is an important part of language education. And I think it links very nicely to the theme of the conference, communication across borders. I guess my talk is perhaps a little different from other talks in this conference. It's not focusing purely on a research project. It's not looking at the nitty-gritty of a particular aspect of pedagogy or at resources, although I would encourage you to take a look at the ECML's website, where you'll find a plethora of resources for everyone working in language education. And you may be wondering then, so what's the relevance to you as lecturers, as teachers, as researchers? Well, maybe if I could just ask you to suspend disbelief for a while and join me in taking a constructive but a critical look at the ECML and more broadly at the role of multilateralism when it comes to language education. And maybe with me entertain the idea that quality language education needs all of us to engage with different aspects, to cross those borders between pedagogy, research, curricula, policy, and between the personal, the professional, and the political borders, which are constantly shifting. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to begin with the context. Now, I know some of you listening may know the centre well, but I'm actually sure many of you don't. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do, situated within the wider context of the Council of Europe, what our values are, a little bit about our current programme. And then I'm going to move into telling you about my own doctoral research, which was a professional doctorate actually directed at critically examining the centre, because I hope that the findings will be of interest to you. And then I'll return to this idea of transnational mediation, of multilateralism, and ask you to consider whether or not you think this is a worthwhile undertaking in the current context. So just a little bit of background. You may have noticed in the title that the ECML is part of the Council of Europe. And I put this little diagram at the bottom simply because the Council of Europe is not very good at promoting itself. And there's a lot of confusion out there about different European institutions. So it's not the European Union, it's not the European Council, which is the decision-making body of the European Union. But that doesn't mean we don't work together, because we ourselves have a very strong partnership with the European Union. But just to remind you, it is in fact the oldest intergovernmental political organisation in Europe, founded shortly after the end of the Second World War, based in Strasbourg, but with different organs outside of Strasbourg, such as the ECML. and founded on these three very important pillars: human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And of course, these were huge challenges facing Europe after the war, but I would say they're still huge challenges. And in fact, the Council's work is as relevant today as it ever was. So it's a political organisation looking at legal instruments, monitoring mechanisms, but also working very much in the field of education. And right now the focus is on education for democracy. What does it mean to live in a democracy, to participate in a democracy? And in that context, language and intercultural communication are, of course, essential. The Council has a very long history in the field of language education, and even if you're not familiar with all the different work that it's done, you will of course know of the CEFR, the Common European Framework, which was developed by the Council of Europe. So that's the wider framework within which the work of the ECML sits. But what about now the ECML itself? Well, I'll come back to that title on my slide in a moment, but I'd like to start with our vision. A Europe committed to linguistic and cultural diversity, where the key role of quality language education in achieving intercultural dialogue, democratic citizenship, and social cohesion is recognised and supported. I think you can already see from the vision how we fit within the wider work of the Council of Europe, and how we view language education not as a standalone, not even as a subject area or a field, but as something that contributes to much wider societal goals. It's a strange thing because, you know, for many years as a language teacher, I didn't think about language education in that way. I was very focused on competences, developing competences in a specific language. But I think now that it's really important to remember that wider perspective, particularly in the current climate of polarization and all of the challenges we're facing as a result of the COVID crisis. So in relation to the wider Council of Europe, we're what's called an enlarged partial agreement. That means countries choose to pay additional fee to be part of the work of the centre. And we're very pleased to announce that we have 34 countries taking part directly in our work. You can see here our strategic objectives: innovation in language learning and teaching, implementation of policy. So we're really there, if you look back at the title, to act as that interface, to support countries with putting policies into practice on the ground. You can see that we run 4-year programs, and from the diagram in the middle, and we chose a heart to demonstrate this diagram because we are very convinced of the role of languages in emotion, in identity formation, in our own self-esteem, that languages really sit at the heart of all learning. The programme has 2 strands: the development strand, innovative projects to develop new resources, and what we call the mediation strand, not in a technical use of the word, but simply in terms of promotion and implementation. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So perhaps now the title makes a little bit more sense to you. We work also at multiple levels. And again, this is an example of border crossing. So within our governing board, we have ministerial representation, but then within each of our member states, we have language centres, we have contact points, we work with a network of teacher education colleges, etc., and with individual experts on the ground, again, working at multiple levels. What does this all mean in terms of an actual programme? Well, just very, very briefly, I'm going to show you what an actual programme looks like. This is our current programme, and we start our programme by asking our member states what their priorities are in language education. And they tell us. And if I just told you some of the themes that they told us before the current programme began, I can imagine that wherever you are in the world listening, these are also topics of interest to you. CLIL, teacher competences, language-sensitive teaching, formative assessment, translanguaging. So there's a lot of commonality in the themes, even though specific challenges may be different in different contexts. We then launch a call for projects, and there is an evaluation process. And these on the screen, you can see the projects chosen for the current programme. I'm not going to go into any of them in any detail. They're there on the website for you to look at in your own time. But again, it's just an example of crossing borders, because there's all sorts of different sectors in here, from the very young to the workplace. And there's many, many different themes being covered in these projects. What happens with projects, of course, is worth commenting on, because although there are 4 experts running the project, they have to then share their ideas and their thoughts in what really is a process of co-construction with experts across all of our member states. And they do this through network meetings and through project workshops. Because what's important is that the resulting resources will actually be possible to adapt and implement in very, very different contexts. There are many examples of these project resources being used in national curricula in different countries, really having an impact on the ground. And here you can see that this process of co-construction continues through what is the bilateral side of our work. The projects are multilateral. This is training and consultancy, where the results of those projects are taken into countries, working with experts in the field on the ground to adapt them to different contexts. And I think that kind of shows you the way that we try to cross borders. And you can see again a range of topics and different challenges there. It's worth commenting for a moment on that process of co-construction. We start with priorities, we have experts working on the development, but then these are piloted and shared through network meetings and project workshops. They're informed by research, and they're then transferable and adaptable, and then there's support given to countries through training and consultancy. So for me, the process is as important as the product. But just for a moment to stop and pause, because that's what we do. But behind that lies a philosophy, and that philosophy links back to the work of the Council of Europe and this emphasis on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. I wanted to show you this diagram. Many of you may already be familiar with it, because for me, it's a kind of visual presentation of the theme of this conference, communication across borders. This time, the borders between languages, or in fact, the artificial borders that perhaps our systems, our school systems erect between these different languages. Because if you think about the learner who's sitting here at the top of this diagram, from the learner's perspective, these borders are not fixed. These are all part of the learner's plurilingual repertoire. I noticed in some of the conference documentation and some of the themes, there's been talk about borderless thinking. I struggle a little bit with that concept, because I think it's actually better to recognize the borders, look for commonalities and differences, and then think about how to navigate the borders and how to make them more permeable. You can see there also from the quotation on the right-hand side of the screen, this link between languages and identity, which is so very strong. And I think all of this idea of the plurilingual habitus, if you tuned into Professor Terry Lamb's keynote, you can see how it chimes with this diagram on the screen. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but maybe just one or two comments. The languages of schooling is the languages that learners bring with them are so important, because these home languages are our primary means of socialization. They are the very basis of our identity and the soil in which our autonomy grows. And if we as educators ignore them, in a sense, we're leaving part of the person, part of the learner outside of the classroom. And that, of course, has very worrying consequences. But it's a holistic approach that we take. And although this diagram is focusing very much on school systems, it goes beyond that. It's about lifelong learning. It's about learner autonomy. It's about socially responsible agents. And actually, it's highly political, because even in the very earliest work of the Council, it talks about participation in pluralist democratic societies and the importance of language in that context. I'm guessing none of you can disagree with this philosophy, but what I think we do need to all recognize is that there are, of course, huge challenges in going from the theory, from the rhetoric, to the reality. And that's where I'd like to link now to my own research. I decided to undertake research because I was questioning the role of the ECML. I was questioning this plurilingual ideal. And I think it's really important to bring some kind of criticality to the table and really think about the added value in a constructive but critical way of multilateralism in the field of language education. And so I'm going to turn very briefly to my research. I won't go into it in too much detail, but this is a quotation from a resolution of the Council of Europe. It was the resolution to confirm the continuation of the ECML after a three-year trial period. And it really got me thinking, if you look at the latter part of the quotation, which leads to questions around the kind of learning the centre wishes to engender. Well, I questioned that too. And here on the screen, you can see what then became my research questions. How do teacher educators perceive their involvement with the ECML in relation to their own professional growth? How does this all sit with our philosophy of plurilingual education? And with all of that in mind, what can we do to really maximize the learning opportunities that we offer? The reason I chose to focus on teacher educators, and specifically language teacher educators, is because in many ways they are the key target group of the ECML. They are the multipliers that we work with. And I use the term very broadly, not just those training future language teachers, but people working in schools with responsibility for teacher development, inspectors, people working in ministries with responsibility for overseeing the professional development of language teachers. So it's used in a broad way, but it's really this idea of the multiplier role. You can see the three constructs there that I try to examine in detail, break them down and look at the points of convergence. And the reason I chose to focus, one of the other reasons, on teacher educators is that research on teacher educators is still, in fact, in its infancy, despite their key role in education. I chose to focus on individuals, on 6 individuals who all are teacher educators in this broader sense, but from very, very different backgrounds, because I wanted really not to focus on an institution. I wanted that personal voice. I wanted their lived experiences and to privilege their voices, which is why I also adopted a narrative-based methodology where I could really hear their stories and tell their stories. So I'm just going to give you some of the key findings briefly. I'm conscious of time. Time is marching on, beginning with plurilingual education. Now, it's really interesting because my research participants were people well versed in plurilingual education, and yet they struggled to define it. And we went back to all the different definitions. And eventually, through a process of dialogic engagement, one of the participants broke it down into these different elements. And I think this is actually a really, really helpful breakdown because it covers a number of aspects of what we mean by plurilingual education. We really see what is meant by the different aspects, starting with the learner in the classroom, but also thinking more broadly about learning strategies. And I think that's also very, very important. thinking about the value of diversity in itself, and this whole question of cultural mediation. Really, how do you cross the linguistic and cultural boundaries? But the fourth element is particularly important, because I think sometimes when we talk about the philosophy of plurilingual education, we forget the importance of actually developing skills in a specific language. And for language teachers, this can kind of threaten their professional identity. So we need to remember that all of these elements matter when we think about plurilingual education. I'll just give you a moment to read the quotation on the screen, which comes from my research. But I think it's wise for us to be vigilant, to keep questioning what we mean by this, and to ensure that when we talk about the vision, we also talk about what steps need to be taken to make that vision a reality on the ground. It's about the holistic approach, but it's also about clarifying, exemplifying, and tailoring the how to the different contexts, the different national, regional, local contexts, and of course, to the different learners we have before us in our classrooms. My findings emerged as tensions. Tensions which I think can be used fruitfully, which we can exploit for learning, between values and implementation, between plurilingualism and the learning of individual languages, between top-down policy and bottom-up agentive approaches to language learning, but between complexity and confusion. And I think it's our job as language educators to really try and clarify some of that confusion. Here you see the three constructs again, and you see my different theoretical frameworks. There isn't time to go into them, but you can see that there are different frameworks. And again, it was about crossing the boundaries between these different theories and actually seeing how they interlinked, that they were kind of embedded, all of them within the broader theme of complexity theory. I'd just like to give you one or two key findings from the other areas and the points of convergence. The professional growth of language teacher educators. I'm sure it would be no surprise to you if I tell you that the findings really stress the importance of ownership of learning, of the link between ownership and agency, agency that's combined with collective and inquiry-based learning, an emphasis on beliefs and values over knowledge and skills, in actively involvement of a range of stakeholders, and of course a focus on praxis, but which goes beyond the local context and on reflection that leads to inquiry. But this really important question of the need to develop a distinct professional identity. The question of identity came up again and again and again. And it's interesting because the research tells us that relatively little is known about the formation of the professional identity of those of us working in teacher education. And it's a theme worth exploring even more. What really emerged was that teacher educators learn best when they engage in a social constructivist learning cycle, which begins with individual reflection, works through articulation towards group reflection, theorization, dialogic engagement, and on to meaning making and ownership of that learning, and then the cycle begins again. And I think it's really interesting because what emerged was that the ECML does provide the conditions to generate that kind of learning. That doesn't mean it always happens. What we need to do is make sure that we really make the most of the conditions available to us. All of the insights that emerged chimed with the kind of learning that takes place through what the literature describes as boundary crossing. Again, very relevant in the context of this conference. And I'd like to just read you out a quote from Ackerman and Bakker, 2011, who did a review of the literature on boundary crossing. They define a boundary as a socio-cultural difference leading to discontinuity in action or interaction. And they identify 4 potential learning mechanisms that can take place at boundaries: identification, coordination, reflection, and transformation. So what do these mean? Identification is that process of recognizing our individual identities and the ways in which they differ. And of course, we do that when we meet people from different backgrounds and different contexts. Then comes, of course, the reflection. There's a creative process where you kind of review what you do through the perspective of the other. And this should really result in a new construction of identity. And when then that significant and long-lasting change is engendered, that really is when we have transformative learning. But it's not easy to get there. It is a challenging process. It's all about that cognitive dissonance. And I think something about working at multilateral level, working with people who come from very, very different backgrounds and different contexts can help us achieve that kind of transformative learning. So the ECML meets those conditions. You can work in small groups, it's task-based, it's a safe space, you're removed from your national context. But we need to ensure that we are exploiting these characteristics to think about and engender the right kind of learning. So I'm not going to go into any more detail there on that. But what also emerged was that the ECML is a complex living system. That idea of that it really is constantly growing and evolving in interaction with all of those involved. I'm just going to finish this little bit on my research with a few quotations from my research, which I think in themselves are very, very revealing. The importance of building those bridges between theory, between principles and visions and philosophies and implementation on the ground, and that working in this community of practices is one way to do this. Here's a comment from someone who really is talking about how much it enriched their own professional growth, and that in a sense, it is a unique opportunity to do that. And here's a more critical one. We need to look at the harmony, at building the bridges between different pedagogical traditions, and not just say there's one size fits all. I think that would be a really dangerous road for us to go down. But this one is one I feel is really, really very powerful. We are working with histories, we are working at borders, and these epistemological conflicts that I see emerging is precisely the moment when the borders are close and we have to cross them. It's really where we cross borders, accept these epistemological conflicts. It's our job, and it's good that this is happening. What do you think of that? This idea of being part of a process of building a plurilingual, intercultural and European identity. I think the role of the ECML as a transnational mediator really came to the fore during the pandemic. Many experts in the field of language education approached us and asked us, they said, you have the platform, you have the networks, please can we run webinars so that we can reach out to the wider community? And I feel very strongly that it's my role as director to really think about how we can exploit the unique boundary crossing characteristics of such a centre, not take them for granted, but really look at how we can improve the learning. In my abstract to this presentation, I talk about the boundaries between the personal, the professional, the pedagogical and the political being permeable. And that's really happened to me, I think, through this job. Personal, of course, my own love of languages. Professional, it's a job. Pedagogical, I'm working with experts and researchers all the time, with teachers and teacher educators. But it's also highly political, the key role that language education can play in building a better future, in building pluralistic democratic societies. And the lines there in my own identity have become blurred. It is constantly evolving, it is dynamic. And I'd just like to finish with a few concluding remarks and some information and resources which I hope will be of use to you. Here's just a quote from one of our experts. Again, to encourage you to think about, if you don't know the centre and you've never been involved, would you like to be part of this community? If you would, please get in touch, because there are many different ways to get involved. I mentioned the way we worked during the crisis. Well, this is an ongoing initiative where we work with many of the NGOs in the field of language education, again, crossing borders, looking at the language, the lessons learned from COVID. There's been a survey, there's been a webinar and 2 think tanks, and very soon there will be a colloquium on the 14th of December. We will be advertising it soon, and you will be able to join us online to hear the discussions and take part in what we feel are some of the lessons learned from COVID. The survey really showed that language teachers across Europe and beyond needed a voice. They needed a platform to express their experiences. And we're developing a series of case studies, which I hope will be useful. I mentioned briefly our anniversary declaration, because this really is a political instrument. If you haven't seen it, please take a look. It now exists in several languages. If you'd like to translate it for us into another language, that would be wonderful. And it's making the case for language education a holistic approach, value-based approach, but recognizing context-specific and differentiated approaches on the ground. And when we're speaking about political, this is perhaps the most political element of my input today. The Council of Europe is currently working on a Committee of Ministers recommendation on the contribution of plurilingual education to democratic culture. It's a really exciting development because it's the first recommendation that is holistic. It's not just focusing, for example, on the languages of schooling or on regional minority languages. It's covering all aspects of language education. I think it's very timely. It was timely before COVID, but COVID has unfortunately widened the linguistic gulfs and all the other gulfs that we have in our societies. And it's giving advice and recommendations at the level of policy, curricula, teacher education and classroom practice. So please keep an eye on this, because it's now been approved by the Education Committee. It will now move up to the Committee of Ministers itself, and we hope that it will be adopted by all of the member states of the Council of Europe. And really, just to come back to the very, very beginning, we're all here today and yesterday and the day before taking part in this conference across the globe because we're convinced of the added value of crossing boundaries. We're convinced of the added value of sharing and learning from each other. And I think we all have a part to play. I think we're sitting at a critical moment in time, in history. There's a real danger that this pandemic will result in a retreat into nationalism. We've already seen it, we see it happening. And there's going to be a fight for resources in education when the crisis is finally over. How high will it be on the agenda of our ministries? Will it take priority? It's something I believe we all need to fight for. And I'd just like to finish with one final quote from one of my research participants, which for me, in some ways, says it all. Drawing on the values of the Council of Europe, the Centre, that is the ECML, must view languages as tools at the service of the development and education of the individual European citizen, and do so with clearly defined and strongly justified political aims, human rights, and quality education for all, but also peace, intercultural dialogue, democratic citizenship, and a culture of democracy. I thank you all very much for listening and would be delighted to take your comments or your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Breslin, for your wonderful and inspiring talk. I don't know if many of us are so much into politics, but this is an area, a domain which we often overlook, I guess, in our work. So this is a very nice contribution to make us think in perhaps more political ways, which actually might help us well, in terms of our work and to give us some orientation and to see with what we might also have to comply. Thank you very much, but you have really enriched our views, if I may say that for the whole audience, by talking about what you were talking about and what you were presenting. Okay, so there's one question, and I'm reading this question to you word by word. It's a long one. So have you ever experienced reactions by teachers, teacher trainers, or authorities, e.g., school district officials or officials in ministries who resist against the idea of developing a European identity because they perceive it as a threat to their own national identity?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a very, very relevant question. And yes, the answer is yes. Sometimes you do come across a certain resistance to the idea. And I think it links to the sort of notion of one nation, one language. And I think at the moment in European politics, there is a trend in that direction. You know, the flows of migration have change some people's political views. I think what we need to do is to not suggest that it's one or the other. For example, learning the language of the host country is absolutely essential for children to succeed in school. But we need to do that within a context of recognizing and valuing the other languages they bring to the table. I think people in official roles at ministries, curriculum directors, etc., it's a question of explaining to them that this is possible, that it's not one or the other. It's again one of these tensions I was talking about, and we can work through those tensions. At the classroom level, sometimes teachers panic because they think, I can't possibly be dealing with all of these different languages. It's not my area of expertise. I'm here to teach French, for example. No one's asking them to. No one's asking them to actively teach these other languages, but it's about valuing the learner in front of you, understanding their own history, the languages that they bring, and allowing that learner to make the links to their other languages. All of these are techniques, and when teachers are exposed to them and see how well they work, attitudes change. So yes, there is a long way to go. And yes, you do meet with pockets of resistance. But I think it's about how you frame the issue, that you do recognize people's worries and concerns, and that you show them that it's possible to have a European identity without losing an individual or a national one.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question. So does the ECML work closely with other counterparts like language centers elsewhere in the world?
That's an interesting question. Of course, it is the European Centre for Modern Languages. So in terms of our member states, it is European countries, but we do have some experts who take part in our work from further afield. We have a strong partnership, for example, with Canada, and many of our events, especially of course now as a result of COVID, are online. So people from other parts of the world can take part. We work with language centres in universities in Europe. We currently have a project that's really focusing on the implementation of the CEFR companion volume in language centres. So again, it is a European centre. It's part of the Council of Europe, but of course that we are very open to working further afield and drawing on the expertise of countries outside Europe.
So you were talking about the conference on the, let's hope we can say aftermath, because we are still in the pandemic, but in the aftermath of the pandemic. Are there any lessons learned which you can talk about for the time being, even before this conference? So what's your idea in the ECML about how we might teach in the future, even before your conference and the findings are presented?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think what we're seeing as a result of the survey, and let me just say that it was a Europe-wide survey with nearly 2,000 responses, predominantly from classroom teachers. certain themes clearly emerge. Of course, there is the whole question of digital literacy, teacher competences. How comfortable do we feel using technology? And of course, the question of infrastructure is absolutely clear, which is one for the decision makers to make sure that the infrastructures are in place. But it's about how to use those tools in pedagogically sound ways, in ways which really contribute to learning. But what has emerged for me, it's almost like the things that we know work well have come back to the fore, stressing learner autonomy, helping learners to recognize their own goals and to work towards their own goals. And in a sense, some of the online learning has really fostered that autonomy. But another one would be, really the active participation of the learner and the teacher's role more as one of facilitator. Now, none of that is new. But I think what the crisis has done is it's really shown us that this is an important way to be in the classroom or online, the digital classroom. Mm-hmm. What we saw, in fact, was huge challenges through the pandemic, but actually we also saw so many people, so many teachers saying, we did it, we managed, we really rose to the challenge. So I think it's a wonderful endorsement of teacher creativity and commitment. And we're through the case studies that we're developing, we're hoping then that people can see how they might be adaptable into their own context. But there are questions for decision makers. One of the huge challenges, of course, was around formative assessment. Cancellation of public examinations. And that exposed the fact that in many places, formative assessment is either not done or not valued. And again, the notion of formative assessment is not a new one, but it's come back. And I really think it's something that we need to take much more seriously as we move forward, hopefully out of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this answer. When you said we all had the feeling we did it, we made it, I guess our audience might feel the same. So we might, when nobody is looking, secretly pat our shoulders, telling ourselves it was not that bad. Actually, we made it to transfer the on-site situation to the online world in many respects. And this is actually something that gave me personally some more professional motivation. Even, okay, I'm highly motivated anyway, but even more now, seeing that it's all quite nice, that works. And now students are telling me, well, actually, we're in Germany at my university, in Saarbrücken, to say that again, because that's the conference name, University of Applied Sciences, not traditional university, we've been going back to campus, but many students say, well, actually, we would like to go online. I mean, I have one class with 25 students being in the same room. Some students said we were afraid because of the virus. And then they said, well, can't we go online? And some others said, we are not afraid, but we want to go online anyway. So that's quite interesting experience now, isn't it?
But if I could just add one thing, I do think that we've done very well, but I do think that particularly in our school systems,
of course,
those learners who do not master the language of schooling really, really lost out. They didn't have the same level of support at home. And I think that gulf has widened. So there is quite a serious challenge for us in making sure that our approaches are much more inclusive and supportive of the more vulnerable learners.
When talking about schools, that's quite another story. That's true. I was talking about universities. And of course, I was talking about students that are actually masters of their own learning, so to speak. Apart from that, that's a totally different question. That's totally correct. Thank you very much for saying that. There's another question. You have repeatedly mentioned that realizing the ideas of social cohesion, democratic citizenship, that's a long one. I start again because it's very long. So you have repeatedly mentioned that realizing the ideas of social cohesion, democratic citizenship, and multilingual education has broader dimensions than education, like the socio-political and cultural dimensions. At this point, do you think European governments are doing their best they can to promote these ideals? Do you have any projects to raise awareness about the issues as ECML?
Thank you. Absolutely, I stress this, the wider contribution that I do believe language education can make to building better societies. Perhaps just to mention in a little bit more detail, the main project, if you can call it a project, where we really are working with governments on this is in fact not so much the ECML, but the wider Council of Europe, is this forthcoming recommendation of the Committee of Ministers. Now, just for you to know, if you don't, the Committee of Ministers are the Ministers of Foreign Affairs from all of the member states. In fact, from the 50 countries signatory to the European Cultural Convention. So if we succeed in getting this recommendation approved by the Committee of Ministers, I think it will be quite a powerful tool, because it's very much about setting out that greater vision, but recognizing that we need to take a step-by-step approach, recognizing that different countries are at different stages in the process, and highlighting that there are two documents, the recommendation itself and what's called an explanatory memorandum. The explanatory memorandum takes the recommendation point by point and guides those who look at it to all of the resources available through the Council of Europe and through its ECML to support implementation. So that would be for me the most important project when it comes to this higher level of the role of language education. And I would encourage you to keep an eye out for it, maybe to find out who it is from your country who sits on the steering committee for education at the Council of Europe, because they have approved it and it's now going to move up to the Committee of Ministers. And I'm really hopeful that we will achieve this, because I think it really will help give us that political push that we need.
Any further questions to be asked? Otherwise, I would like to add one more point. Being an Anglicist and a Romanist myself, in the Romanist world, or the Romance world, so to speak, there's the idea of intercomprehension. So what about the intercomprehension? Actually, that means that once you speak one Romance language, you can understand others. So somebody who speaks Spanish can understand Italian. That's not a problem because these languages are quite close. But even if somebody speaks French, there are high chances that he or she can understand Spanish texts, for example, or Italian texts. That's the idea of intercomprehension. So what about the ECML and this notion of intercomprehension?
Yes, it's a very important part of our work. Intercomprehension is one of the approaches which we refer to as the pluralistic approaches, and they are embedded within the framework of reference for pluralistic approaches, FREPA, which you perhaps are aware of. FREPA is a very, very important tool developed by the experts through the ECML and is now being used in many countries in their curricula. But also, I think Professor Terry Lamb in his talk, he talked about supporting multilingual classrooms, which is one of our training and consultancy activities. And that is very much based around a range of pluralistic approaches, of which intercomprehension is one. I think it's a very useful approach. I think drawing attention to similarities and differences is always good for our metacognition. But of course, it's not enough, because you're maybe working with learners who do not have any languages in common. But it's a very important approach, and it's one that we promote widely.
I mean, if we think of the fact that 50% of the English vocabulary is Latin or Romance-based, that's quite something, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Just pronunciations are a little bit different.
Yes, they are.
Dr. Breslin, Sarah, if I may, we do thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.